Chapter 611 Angels and Devils by Heidesgrain. Minutes turned into hours as Jason continued to fly through the sky, but he was not bored at all. He was happy to feel the bright sun rays on his fair skin while looking out for lush green areas where societies were most likely to habituate. This was easier said than done, and Jason saw nothing but the same arid land in the range of several kilometers around him. Nevertheless, he was not bothered by that at all and rather happy because it gave him more time to find a concrete concept to determine a prior being's strength. Jason began to add the cultivation path others cultivated as a prefix because it made everything much easier for him. It sounded weird to him, but when he thought about prior beasts, it was evident that their physical strength was their biggest unique selling point. The same applied to the other two cultivation paths, but they were not as important for Jason as the prior path. With time passing at a slow pace, he got enough time to think about everything clearly, and it was only later that he understood something important. The path of primordial energy and its cultivation base are not necessarily correlated to the number of life force drops. Jason had figured this out when he had seen a prior beast with only 3 life force drops, tearing apart a Marist beast at the Prisma stage on the ground below him. Because he witnessed this, Jason was finally able to figure out that both life force drops and a prior being's cultivation base were not linked to each other. At least, that was what he first thought. But if that's true, why did my physical strength increase after Petri liquefied more drops of life force? Jason had witnessed the amplification of his physical strength after Petri had liquefied more life force drops for the first time. As such, he knew that life force drops were able to enhance the strength of beings. This, however, didn't mean that the life force was connected to the cultivation stage of Petri. Maybe the life force drops have an enhancement effect. With enough overflowing energy, Petri might have produced them thinking that it was useful, owing to the life force drops he had already absorbed once. Jason thought that it was possible for life force drops to enhance the physique similar to how mana, or spirit drops could do the same. As such, he had to discard his earlier thought of evaluating prior beasts according to the number of liquefied drops of life force in them. Even if it was rather annoying, Jason couldn't simply ignore this fact as it might save his life in the future. So that means, I can only gauge the strength of prior beasts according to the fluctuations they release. At least it is possible for my Emperor eyes to determine how much primordial energy prior beings have stored in their body. Knowing how much primordial energy was stored in the body of other beings allowed Jason to determine whether he would have to face unexpected surprises such as a sudden, yet the drastic increase of his opponent's strength, or be prepared for other things he couldn't even think of right now. This made Jason feel a little better, but it was not really helpful to make him feel extremely comfortable around prior beings. Jason was not sure how much time had passed, but the sun had been replaced by utter darkness, with the gigantic moon he could see up in the air, radiating a bright glow. It looked like dawn was approaching and it was almost time for sunrise. With the first rays of the sun brightening the barren plains, Jason's eyes widened in joy as he saw a large lush field of verdant grass in the horizon. This made him circulate mana through his body as he exerted the floating sky technique to further increase his speed. He wanted to reach the verdant grass as quickly as possible. However, before he could even reach its proximity, Jason decreased his pace, making it look like he was gliding just a few meters above the surface. With the Emperor eyes, he could see several tens of thousand unstable energy fluctuations, separated into 2 large groups. They were evidently fighting against each other, but that was not what had caused Jason to slow down. Every single being in front of one group was humanoid, and seemed to be cultivating in the path of mythic power, Marist. This was interesting because it told Jason that the other race probably cultivated mana. Under normal circumstances, this would have made him happy, but not now. At first glance, there was only one race fighting the other, but that was not the case. The closer he came, the more details he could see, including the beings that flew through the sky. There are angels and devils fighting each other in the sky. Just what kind of fairy tale did I enter? Jason couldn't believe his eyes, but even after rubbing them, he could hardly contain himself. There were a total of 3 races fighting against each other, and 2 of them were definitely angels and devils respectively. At least, if he were to name them solely based on their appearance and the fairy tales his mother had told him when he was young. As a matter of fact, the angels didn't look much different than Jason right now because of Artemis' wings. Only the milky aura around the angels made them different to him in addition to the faint halo that surrounded their head. As for the devils, the skin had varying shades of black, purple, dark blue, while some even had a mixture of all these colors. But that was not what made Jason believe that they were the devils belonging to the fairy tales he had heard. Rather, it were the completely crimson-colored eyes in addition to the eerie blackish hue enveloping them that made him believe so. They were utilizing various affinities such as poison, darkness, blood, shadow, and multiple other affinities that could be labeled to be stereotypical abilities devils would use in fairy tales. Meanwhile, the angels he saw were exactly the same, using bright affinities that would make Jason believe that they were good, and devils were bad. However, Jason had long since decided to ignore stereotypes and prejudices one would normally have against certain beings. It was impossible for anyone to be completely good, or bad, and within everyone, there was an evil and good person at the same time. In the end, some traits were just difficult to perceive. As such, Jason could only observe the battle that seemed to be reaching its climax soon. Even at a distance of more than 10 kilometers, he could feel the shockwaves of certain beings fighting each other, carried by the air currents towards him with a rippling force. This made his heart thump wildly, but he managed to calm down a moment later. Through the shockwave, Jason felt as if something deep within him was moving. It were the locks of the Celestia bloodline that were rattling wildly, showing signs of wanting to be unlocked. However, Jason could only ignore it for a moment as he sensed the energies within the shockwaves. Wait, weren't the angels and devils cultivating with mana? How come I sense spiritual force and primordial energy from some of them too? Sensing this, Jason, who had calmed down from his earlier shock, couldn't help but insert even more mana than usual into his Emperor eyes. Ignoring the high mana consumption, he forced his eyes to work at a rapid pace, only to release a tiny fraction of his Celestia aura and stigma, further enhancing the abilities of the Emperor eyes. All of them are definitely cultivating in the path of Marist. No wait, that's wrong. The warriors on the ground don't have a mana core, did I see wrong? But wait. Do the angels and devils have 2 cultivation paths? Is that really possible? Jason couldn't believe his eyes at first, but the angels had certainly 2 places to store their energies. One was a mana core and they also had a spirit sea. Meanwhile, the devils he sighted in the air had a mana core, which was something he already knew, but they also had primordial energy stored in their body and some of them even had liquefied life force drops. If that wasn't enough, more surprises awaited him. Because he had been interested in the angel and devil race that fought against each other, he hadn't even paid any attention to the third race. However, this was the case because Jason was overly familiar with them. What the hell is going on? Those are humans, or not? And why are they fighting each other? Just what is wrong with this planet? Chapter 612 Cultivation Veins by Hydesgrain. Jason was utterly dumbfounded at the sight in front of him. Not only were a few angels and devils able to cultivate in 2 cultivation paths, but there were also beings that looked just like him. The humans, or what he presumed to be humans, were fighting each other under the banner of the respective races he simply called angels and devils. However, what caused Jason to squint his eyes in doubt was the fact that the humans were either cultivating with primordial energy or spiritual force. Thus their cultivation paths were that of Prior and Spiral, and that was exactly how they were separated under the banner of the angel and devil race. Those cultivating with primordial energy were following the devils while the other humans who had awoken the cultivation path of spiritual force were following the angels. Seeing and processing this information was extremely confusing, and even more so was the fact that both sides were releasing a distinct hue that was strikingly similar to that of the angels and devils. Is the hue created by some sort of cultivation or martial art technique? Jason wondered as he continued to watch the fight from far away. While the angels and devils were fighting against each other in the air, the throng of humans was clashing on the ground. Most spiral humans were working together, using their spiritual force to do all kinds of things to distract their opponents, and humans following the path of primordial energy were relying on their physical strength to fight. The entire battlefield appeared to be much worse than the entire Great Argos War, but Jason's mind was void of pity for any of them. He was simply analyzing the situation while calming down his erratic heart and trying to control the seals on his bloodline that wanted to be unleashed. Being able to see distinct details, Jason was able to perceive that every human had 2 specific cultivation veins in their body. This was something he could only see with a tremendous amount of mana he consistently supplied to his Emperor eyes, unleashing details he had never seen before. On Argos, this would be impossible, but Jason was not on the mana-scarce planet anymore. Instead, he was on a planet that had all 3 cultivation energies, in a density and purity he could have only dreamed of on Argos. The humans or whatever they are have 2 cultivation veins, but only one seems to awaken under normal circumstances. That means both the prior and spiral cultivation veins are within a human's body with only one of them that is activated. This might be the deciding factor to determine which side they will be standing on, otherwise, there would be humans with primordial energy under the banner of the angels, or am I wrong? Observing the situation was interesting, but at the same time, it cleared his mind of some of his doubts. Jason was cultivating with mana, and thus following the path of Marist, which was something no other human was doing, at least, on mana. As such, he couldn't act like he was a human in order to gain easy entry into a foreign society. However, Jason was already thinking of something else he could do, which caused a faint smile to emerge on his face. My Celestia aura, despite not having the divine pressure and radiation, should be more than enough to show that I might even be superior to the angels. So, I might be able to enter the angels' society. With Artemis wings, it could be even easier. Jason tried to formulate a plan while observing the entire battle through the Emperor eyes that were supplied with the large amount of mana his sub-area was passively absorbing. Everything looked interesting, but the most impressive were the few particular devils and angels that cultivated in 2 cultivation paths at once. Jason was still not sure why he thought that everyone had a mana core when he saw the humans first, but he just told himself that it was an illusion because he was reminded of the human race on Argos. In the end, they were 2 completely different races because the humans on Argos could only cultivate with mana. Meanwhile, the ones he was looking at were able to cultivate with primordial energy, or spiritual force, depending upon the kind of cultivation vein they activated. That was not everything, and there were several other aspects of the human-like race in front of him that were different from humans on Argos and mana, such as the appearance. Men on mana had a bulkier physique and they looked more refined than men on Argos. At the same time, the demeanor was completely different and it looked like they were fighting with their life on the line without showing any mercy. Yet, at the same time, they seemed to respect their opponents and would rather die while playing a fair game than using petty tricks. This was dumb in Jason's opinion, but it was not like he would bother about that. As for women, those on mana looked much more beautiful, and he could only assume that this was because of the purer energies they were absorbing, contrary to the impure mana on Argos. In the end, Jason was not sure about that, but the angels were still the most beautiful with their flawless skin and near-perfect facial features. Even he was not sure whether some of them were more beautiful or handsome than he was. All of this was extremely intriguing and piqued his curiosity, but at the same time, Jason couldn't help but feel a little bit shocked by the strength everyone was exerting. There was not a single being weaker than him, and this made him be prepared for the worst. Jason had yet to come across a single being at the mortal stage, and he was either in one of the regions he should rather not be, or his timing was simply unfortunate. He was not sure how long the battle would last, and instead of being dragged into it, Jason decided that it was time to leave, now that he had seen everything important. Being able to perceive the strength of individuals that belonged to an society, made it obvious how careful he had to be upon entering one. A single mistake could lead to his execution because Jacen had yet to figure out the culture and mannerisms of the other races. There were several things he didn't know, and the most confusing was the fact that the human race was being led by two different races, seemingly forced to fight each other because of the cultivation veins they had awakened. Despite that, Jacen decided that it would be best to leave now because the entire battlefield seemed to be slowly moving towards him. Thus, he wanted to fly towards his right side in order to make a huge detour. However, it was exactly at that moment that his Emperor eyes perceived something with tremendous energy currents charging straight towards him. Jacen's eyes widened, yet, he was unable to determine what exactly the being that was approaching him with a terrific speed was. The only thing Jacen could tell was that it was a humanoid being with white wings and a halo around her head. The very signs of the angels from earlier versus the one he saw charging towards him confused Jacen. That was owing to the fact that his Emperor eyes cited the existence of primordial energy and the darkness affinity within the body of the being that looked like an angel on the outside. The closer it came, the more details could be determined, and it was only when she was less than a kilometer away from him that Jacen noticed the reason for all of this. She has 3 cultivation veins, and all of them have been awoken. Chapter 613 Encounter by Hydesgrain. The angel, or whatever he was seeing, was in fact a young-looking woman who had awoken all 3 cultivation veins. Having mastered cultivation with all 3 energies would normally mean that her cultivation speed had slowed down, as she would have to put in thrice the effort, but clearly, that was not the case. Rather, the woman he saw was extremely powerful. Her mana core was filled with 9 small prismarine crystals. There were 3 large rotating crystals, and each of them consisted of 3 of the small prismarine crystals, and 1 single crystal enveloping the entire inner part of the mana core. This meant that she had reached the peak of the Prisma stage according to her Marist cultivation base. However, that was not everything, and Jacen could clearly tell that her strength was by no means superior to all the angels and devils he had seen earlier. Even those whose mana core had looked different, as if it had been transformed, paled in comparison to hers. This was probably what happened once one broke into the Ascendian stage. By breaking into the Ascendian stage, the traits awoken through the soul awakening, such as affinities and abilities, were said to merge with the vessel one had, enhancing each other tremendously. Jacen found this interesting, but he had no idea how this was supposed to work with several vessels one created if one had awoken more than 1 cultivation vein. Right now, this was not important because Jacen had to protect himself from getting squashed by the pressure released by the golden-haired woman. She looked exactly like an angel to him, with her fair skin, flawless facial features, long golden hair floating through the wind, and long, slender legs. Under normal circumstances, Jacen would simply ignore others, even if their physical appearance was otherworldly, but somehow with that angel of a woman in front of him, his body seemed to momentarily forget basic coordination. He was hovering on the spot and even forgot to move away as he noticed that the woman was staring at him, his eyes glued to her face. She had long eyelashes, and her beautiful eyes that were silver in color caused him to freeze in place. Awestruck, he simply watched as a crimson ring formed around her pupils, causing Jacen's eyes to widen. Ever since he had received his father's help to prevent himself from turning into an infernal Celestia, he had acquired a faint, almost untraceable crimson-colored ring, outlining his pupils. However, owing to his mostly golden-colored iris that had traces of a silver color, the crimson color got shadowed, which was completely different from the woman he saw. She continued to stare straight into his eyes, causing her to be bewitched the moment her eyes met his. Never in her entire life had she seen eyes like Jacen's, because the distinct golden color intertwined with faint silver traces was mesmerizing. Yet, even worse, and the reason for her to be bewitched, were the emotions that were seemingly radiating from the golden eyes. They didn't release a single trace of the lustful gazes she always received, let alone the intent to attack her, which was something she had to face almost every day. The eyes of the young, winged being in front of him were just radiating kindness and a little surprise as a faint smile emerged on Jacen's face. Jacen was not sure why he smiled, but he found the young woman to be extremely interesting. Words failed to describe her ethereal beauty, and it would be a disgrace to compare her to women on Argos. Her appearance outshined all the other women he'd seen earlier on the battlefield. However, what made Jason the most interested in the woman who had almost brushed past him was the fact that she had multiple repulsive affinities in her body in addition to not one but 3 awakened cultivation veins. There was more to her than what meets the eye, and Jason had yet to decipher everything that she had cleverly concealed. But from what he could sense and see, she was exactly the same as he and Whis were. A halfling. He blurted out, unsure whether he was perceiving everything correctly. With the holy, light, darkness, and shadow affinity in her body, Jason was relatively sure of his assumption to be correct. But that didn't mean it had to be true because there were too many things he had yet to figure out. In the end, Jason could only decide to ignore his assumption for now as he shook his head, breaking the eye contact he and the mysterious young woman had maintained all this while. This freed the young woman of her bewitched state, and she blinked rapidly to get her bearings. Under normal circumstances, she would have killed the being that affected her mind, but that was not what she did right now. Acting against her usual self, Jennifer, the young woman couldn't help but feel interested in the being, whom she passed by with a terrific speed. While brushing past him, she sensed the faintly released Celestia aura, Jason's stigma, and the bright golden glow around his eyes. Perceiving all of this, in addition to the earlier sensation, made it impossible to suppress her emotions like usual. Before she knew it, a faint smile escaped her lips, adorning her usually neutral and emotionless face. But she quickly realized this, and only a moment later she put on the mask of a stoic, emotionless woman before she shot past Jason, advancing to the battlefield, without another backward glance. Meanwhile, Jason couldn't help but feel goosebumps erupting all over his skin when he saw the genuine, enchanting smile on the young woman's face that merely lasted a few seconds. It was as if he had been hit by his own petrification curse, seemingly turning him into a stone statue that levitated in the air. Jason was not sure how much time had passed, but when he regained his senses, he couldn't help but blurt out, "What the hell just happened?" Confused about the torrent of emotions that had hit him, Jason turned towards the battlefield, only to see the exact woman he had just faced a moment earlier massacring her way through the battlefield. However, instead of siding with the angels or devils, she simply massacred every single being in her way without holding back. This was even more confusing than their earlier encounter that caused various emotions within Jason to emerge, emotions he never knew existed before. He had never felt like that, which made him interested in finding out whether this was because of the uniqueness that radiated from the woman, the fact that she cultivated in 3 cultivation paths, or just her magnificent appearance. In the end, everything about her made Jason curious, including the question of why she killed both angels, devils, and the humans who were brave or stupid enough to come in her way. Not knowing what her plan was, the entire scene unfolding in front of him looked like sheer madness to Jason, who had completely forgotten that he had planned to leave the battlefield. His eyes were fixated on the woman who had the outer appearance of an angel, only that she didn't release any hue around her. Initially, he assumed that her situation was not problematic, only to realize that she had to face several beings at the Ascendian stage at the same time. This made Jason grow worried, which was something he didn't expect to feel for someone he had never even talked to before. Suddenly, he noticed something he had failed to see before. Apparently, the young woman had put on a mask before she had entered the battlefield, and Jason hadn't realized this because he had been mesmerized by her smile. Just what is she planning to do? Jason wondered, only for his eyes to widen once again as he blurted out, "That's possible." Chapter 614 Interest by Hydesgrain. The mask made him wonder what was going on, only to see a new pair of wings sprouting out of the young woman's back as she released 2 repulsive affinities in the form of a hue, at once. With a holy, yet sinister hue enveloping the young woman, her entire demeanor changed, making Jason wonder whether the beautiful woman and the one he was seeing right now were the same. While one pair of her wings was pure and milky white, devoid of even the slightest taint caused by another color, the second pair was pitch black in color, and created a stark contrast to the spotless white. In addition to the hue she radiated, the young woman released all three types of energies she had stored within her body at the same time, in addition to her holy and darkness affinity. Due to this, everything changed in a moment, and the young woman managed to turn the tide in her favor, making her combat prowess skyrocket. Even the beings at the Ascension stage couldn't help but retreat a few meters after seeing her transform. At that moment, two swords manifested in the woman's hands. One of them glowed in a bright white light while the other one radiated an ominous dark aura. Both swords were inserted with the respective transmuted mana that activated several runes, only to adjust their size similar to Byakuya. From the looks of it, the young woman could wield and control her weapons much better than Jason could. At least, if one solely looked at the adjustment of the weapon's size, which was something he had not used often enough. It was only a few times that he had adjusted Byakuya's size, which made Jason wonder if he should have used it frequently. He was still at the battlefield instead of flying away as he had initially planned. Somehow, Jason looked intently at the fight that had started kilometers away from his location. The rush of the battle that seemed to sweep through the warriors was contagious. Before he knew it, adrenaline surged through his entire body, despite being a mere bystander and not being the one who was actively fighting. His mind was fully focused on those beings that had awoken at least 2 cultivation veins. As such, there were only a few devils and angels amongst them, including the young woman he had encountered earlier, and a total of 3 humans. He was still not sure what their race was called, and whether he and the other humans were, in fact, of the same race, or just had a similar appearance. However, what Jason knew was the fact that 2 young women and 1 man had awoken both the prior and spiral cultivation vein. Yet, at the same time, they were fighting for one side, only actively cultivating in one path, and Jason's Emperor eyes perceived a distinct fear radiating from them. This made their stance clear, showing that the angel and devil race had something against humans that could cultivate in both paths. Even if Jason had yet to get to know the 3 races' culture, relationship, and much more, it was evident that the cultivation veins of the human race determined their affiliation. Did she enter the battlefield because of them? A sudden doubt struck him, and he couldn't help but look more intently at the battlefield. The angels and devils at the Prisma stage retreated back from the young woman, who was evidently a halfling of the devil and the angel race, clearly showing that they were, by no means, friends. As such, Jason could only conclude that the halfling had no reason not to kill anyone, as the Ascension stage devils and angels were trying to do exactly that, kill her. Despite seeing this, the young woman didn't kill anyone at the Ascension stage, and only heavily injured those who had awoken the Marist cultivation vein. Through this, Jason was able to determine that beings who had 2 awakened cultivation veins were not only rare talents belonging to the devil and angel race, but that the young woman didn't want to offend the races by killing their talents. So, there are even stronger beings backing their race. Not like I could have expected that. Jason scratched the back of his head, wondering how strong the powerhouses of the devil and angel race were. Knowing it might be important for the future because he didn't want to be restricted, let alone enslaved like last time when years ago, he had caught the Drake clan's patriarch's interest. The strong and powerful would always try to get their hands on the talented, but on mana, or to be precise with the 3 races in front of him, this seemed to be a little bit different. Tremendous shockwaves rippled through the surrounding cores due to the young woman who used all of the 3 cultivation energies at once in addition to her holy and darkness affinity. None of her opponents stood a chance against her might, and she got rid of them without a hassle. However, that was only the first step of her plan, and Jason got a premonition that she was up to something. Because of that, he circulated a tremendous amount of mana through his body while exerting the floating sky movement technique. Flying around the battlefield in a big detour, Jason took more than 10 minutes to reach the thriving verdant plains, but his eyes never left the battlefield. The young woman who had been fighting against humans, angels, and devils had sustained shallow injuries, but she was mostly fine. Her only issue was the high energy consumption coupled with the equally high focus she had to steadily maintain in order to release 3 cultivation energies and control it properly while using 2 repulsive affinities. Jason was not sure if he could do something like that for more than 10 minutes, but that was not important right now. Rather, he was astonished that the young woman had a firm grasp on all the 3 humans who had awoken 2 cultivation veins. They had been visibly trying to conceal that fact, and Jason assumed that only beings like him, with mana eyes, could determine whether someone had awoken 1 or multiple cultivation veins. Even then, Jason was not sure what kinds of traits allowed one to see the depths of someone else's body as his Emperor eyes did. This made him curious about how exactly the young woman had been able to determine that the 3 humans she was carrying through the air before zooming out of the battlefield had awoken both cultivation veins in their body. She could have a similar trait as my Emperor eyes, or she just got her intel from someone else. Smiling dryly, Jason wondered why he was so curious about the mysterious woman, but in the end, he just shook his head, before looking in the direction she had departed. It was exactly the direction she had come from, making him believe that he would have gotten into huge trouble if he had remained there. As such, he could only thank his gut feeling as he turned around, entering the flourishing plains, which lifted his mood as he didn't have to see the boring, barren lands with the pungent smell again. Chapter 615 Vassal by Hydesgrain. Jason was really interested to find out if it was possible for him to cultivate with multiple energies too. For now, this was impossible because his very first attempt to absorb primordial energy had almost damaged his cultivation vein. But now that the seals on his Celestia bloodline were trembling violently, seemingly trying to unleash something that was locked from him, Jason realized that it was not unlikely for his secondary or tertiary bloodline awakening to transform his cultivation vein too. This was not something he could be sure about, but it wouldn't make sense for humans to be able to cultivate in several paths at once, only for him, the descendant of a Celestia, to be unable to do the same. However, there was also the possibility that the Celestia race were simply beings unparalleled in the field of Marist and control over mana. In the end, Jason's knowledge about his heritage was too shallow to satiate his curiosity, but there was nothing he could do to change it right now. What he could be absolutely certain of was that binding beasts of other cultivation paths to his soul was possible. As such, despite the possibility of not being able to cultivate in the path of Prior and Spiral, Jason was bound to receive benefits from soul bonds like Petri, who increased his physical strength tremendously. With that thought in mind, Jason realized that it was not the most important to be able to cultivate in other paths, but that he and his soul bonds just had to be the best in their respective field. While that applied the most to his soul bonds, it was slightly different for Jason because of said amplification he received from each of his soul bonds. His overall strength was the accumulated strength of his beasts that was added to his own strength. This was what essentially made the soul awakening of the human race on Argos so powerful, which paved the path for mankind to become a strong race. Jason was sure of this fact, and only being enslaved, suppressed, or being annihilated before the true potential was reached could probably hinder humans on Argos from becoming powerful. Smiling lightly at the thought of his vast soul world, he entered the depths of the flourishing plains. After entering the plains, Jason encountered an unusually higher number of beasts than before, but none of them attacked him directly. Most of them were content with showing their energy fluctuations the moment he brushed past them, indicating that they would fight for their territory if needed. When he perceived this, Jason couldn't help but feel amused, thinking that the beasts on Mana were less aggressive than those on Argos. These beasts mostly focused on their territory, the available resources, and growing stronger. The beasts on Mana are definitely more intelligent than those on Argos, maybe the overlords are an exception. Still, to think that their behavior is just like that of foreign races, it feels odd. Even if he was intrigued, Jason's mind was focused on trying to find a place where he could rest. He had been awake for longer than a month and had initially planned to rest and catch up on some sleep once he saw the signs of the surface. Little did he know that a simple, almost vertical tunnel would lead him directly to the surface. After that, he didn't feel like sleeping because the surrounding made him feel uncomfortable. This had now changed, and Jason decided to look out for a territory of an extremely strong beast that wouldn't bother about a lowly second-lick stage sleeping in the outskirts. Many weaker beasts slept, ate, and lived in the territory of stronger beasts. On one hand, this was not exactly weird as long as they didn't seize the cultivation resources of the stronger beast, but on the other hand, Jason wondered if that was even impossible to avoid. Maybe the stronger beasts start killing other beasts once the energy currents around it are not dense enough to satisfy it anymore. Jason thought that this made sense because the surrounding beasts were also cultivating, and only with enough energy would they progress further. As such, once too many beasts were cultivating in a particular region, the amount of mana available would be less than that without cultivating beasts. In the end, this was also the reason for Jason to decide that it was best to stay on the outskirts. He was not sure how much mana he had absorbed in a short period in comparison to other beasts, but it was definitely not little. Thus, he had to avoid becoming the target of the strongest beast in the territory, which was the easiest by staying at the outskirts, or possibly even at the shared border of another territory. With that, Jason would rather try to make it look like the adjacent territory was absorbing too much mana, influencing the other territory. This was a mind game, but he had to resort to such tactics because his cultivation base was one of the lowest. Even if that thought was frustrating, he had to cope with the new circumstances and the fact that even the Ascendian stage might not be enough to become something better than a leader of a few soldiers. At least, that's what Jason concluded from the battlefield he had seen before, in addition to the fact that only double cultivation vein awakened beings were special. They were probably younger and fighting one of their first few battles against each other. Jason assumed while questioning himself if there were more races other than the devils, angels, and humans. He didn't think that this was likely, however, that was only his gut feeling because he had only seen the 3 races until now. There were no other soldiers fighting alongside members of these 3 races that would hint at an alliance, or a federation of multiple races. This might as well be wrong, but not something Jason had to be concerned about right now. Rather, he was more interested in the combat prowess of the double cultivation vein awakened beings. While the young woman had looked like a combat veteran despite being young, the others were still not as skilled in releasing 2 energies at once as she had been. Combining the intel he had acquired, Jason could also roughly predict the beasts at the Ascendian stage looked like they were controlling lands, only to be considered as something similar to a vassal. The strongest beings in the areas should be above the Ascendian stage. Despite that, Jason was not even sure whether the surrounding region was reigned by beasts, or separated into the devil and angel race territory. He simply ignored the possibility of humans reigning the lands because they fought under the banner of the other races while revealing their fear. In the end, this was extremely important to know for the future, and even now it could become a deciding factor where he should cultivate and where he shouldn't. Unfortunately, owing to the fact that he didn't know the answer, Jason could only follow his instincts while looking for a place with some, but not too less a number of beasts roaming around. Too few beasts meant that the area was likely to be dangerous and too many were an indicator that chaos would break out soon. As such, after flying for a whole day, distancing himself from the battlefield, hopefully preventing anyone from finding him, he finally sighed in relief. It was only when Jason felt safe that he decided to use a field with thousands of large stones protruding out of the ground in order to hide his presence from other beasts. They couldn't even perceive his aura, stigma, or mana currents because Jason had concealed all of that, to have some peace and sleep soundly. Cultivating with a rested mind will be much better. Chapter 616 Worth of a Cultivation Technique by Hydesgrain. After spending most of the following day sleeping, Jason had regained his vigor, and he was able to start cultivating with a rested mind. Because of that, he was able to evaluate his situation clearly, which in turn allowed him to determine that he should start learning how to cultivate the balance of the universe technique while sitting cross-legged. There were several types of difficulties in front of him, with the harder ones allowing a higher cultivation speed, but Jason thought that the simplest method was already more than enough for him to use. That was mostly because the more difficult cultivation stances demanded an extremely high amount of mana to be utilized at once, and Jason was not sure if his body could hold so much mana for now. He was only at the second lick stage after all. In the end, starting from the easiest and slowly advancing to the next, more difficult level of the balance of the universe cultivation technique was the best he could do. As such, Jason began to practice the technique without seriously cultivating it for now, testing out all kinds of possibilities, restrictions he had and things he had to pay attention to. Meanwhile, Petri, Artemis and Solaris were outside the Soul World, with both Petri and Artemis were in their largest form to rest next to Jason. This may be dangerous, but Jason cultivating alone was far riskier. At least his 3 soul bonds could pay attention to the surroundings while he cultivated after sitting cross-legged. An entire day passed in which Jason familiarized himself with the balance of the universe technique's first level before he finally began to cultivate. With his own mana, he initiated the cultivation process, starting the complex circulation set of his mana, opening his pores while creating a strong suction force. Only a moment later, Jason absorbed faint streams of mana from his surroundings that gradually increased. Using the absorbed mana to continue with the mana circulation, he created an endless cycle of absorbing mana, circulating it through his body before it was annexed. The annexed mana that was stored inside his mana core was slowly liquefied, without affecting his mana absorption. This was the most important part of the cultivation technique he used. Not only could he absorb huge streams of mana much more than what he could without a cultivation technique, but it was also possible to liquefy his mana at the same time. Jason couldn't do that without the cultivation technique earlier because he hadn't learned how this was possible before. Knowing it now was nice, but it took him quite a while before becoming proficient with the balance of the universe's technique. The first level was already extremely difficult and complex despite being the simplest, but that only told Jason that he had a long way ahead of him before he could reach the peak. By releasing his stigma and the Celestia aura without holding back, Jason could accelerate the entire cultivation process, only for his soulbond's stigma to glow brightly next to his. Jason had already noticed it a few times, but only now could he clearly distinguish between them. With several stigma that emitted the same glow, Jason and his soul bonds could accelerate their energy circulation speed, energy output, and even mastery over their respective cultivation energy. This was great, and something extremely helpful as it allowed him to liquefy 10 drops of mana every day, for the first few days. After the 10th day of cultivating, he was able to almost double this amount because his proficiency with the cultivation had increased drastically, and after a total of 2 months Jason reached the highest proficiency of the first level. Through this, he could liquefy 25 drops of mana every single day. That was under the condition that he was in a fully focused state and cultivated for the entire day, which was something he was now able to do. In the beginning, his mind had been preoccupied with the possibility of him being attacked by other beasts, but that didn't happen even once. He found it to be weird, considering that his Celestia aura should pique the curiosity of some beasts. However, even curious beasts were something he hadn't sensed a lot. Not many beasts were roaming around freely through the entire field of stones, a fact that had made him feel both curious and slightly worried. Fortunately, there were at least a handful of beasts, and by looking at their cultivation base, affinities, and other traits, Jason assumed that they were extremely strong, and rare to spot. He had yet to come across beasts with double awakened cultivation veins, but hopefully, one of them could be found at the stone field. After spending some time scouting for such beasts, he spotted a small fox that had awoken the path of Maristan Spiral. It was as sly as one expected from the folklore he had been told by his mother. Nevertheless, the fox didn't attack him, and Jason even assumed that it was the reason for the small number of beasts around the area. This was advantageous as it allowed him to cultivate properly, without being interrupted for a total of 4 months. He would have loved to cultivate longer, but something interrupted him, making it impossible for Jason to continue with what he had planned. After 4 months of tireless cultivation, he had liquefied a total of around 3,500 mana drops. This increased his strength tremendously as each drop required 3 times the amount of mana a normal liquefied mana drop would require. That alone was already enough to elevate his strength to the peak of the 10th lick stage, but that was not everything that had happened. While he cultivated tirelessly, Artemis, Petri, and Solaris increased their strength too. However, as they couldn't cultivate in a fully focused state, they were unable to reach a state similar to Jason. Nevertheless, it was still enough for Artemis to liquefy a total of 720 mana drops in 4 months, while Petri was able to cultivate at an extremely fast pace too. He had reached the 6th lick stage with primordial energy, and thus was Jason's second strongest soul bond. As for his strongest soul bond, it was Solaris, with strength that none of his other soul bonds could even come close to. During the 4 months everyone had cultivated, Solaris had enough time to compress its first solidified prismarine crystal, allowing it to reach the Prisma stage. As such, Solaris had officially broken into the Prisma stage, increasing its flame's lethality several times. There was a huge gap between beings at the Prisma stage and those at the Lick stage that led to the corresponding difference in one's combat prowess increasing several times over. In the past, Jason's abyssal effect and other means to forcefully put a human at the Prisma stage to sleep had only been possible because said powerhouse had put his guard down. Additionally, the powerhouse had solidified prismarine crystals that had been crudely manifested, preventing an efficient enhancement and future cultivation progress. As such, despite having seemingly defeated someone at the Prisma stage, he was only a human, who hadn't cultivated with cultivation manuals, didn't practice any body refining technique, let alone learn a Terra martial art technique. Because of that, even his combat prowess of around 15,000 drops of liquefied mana that was in fact 1.5 solidified prismarine crystal didn't even graze the combat prowess of someone at the first threshold of the Prisma stage, with 1 solidified prismarine crystal. Jason was aware of this, but there was no need for him to be worried because brute force was not everything he had. There was still Solaris, his 2 other soul bonds with which he could form a fusion, his Emperor Eyes, and his Celestia bloodline. Chapter 617 Humans by Hydesgrain. Jason didn't have much to do, and he had planned to cultivate until his combat prowess alone would be enough to overwhelm a beast at the first threshold of the Prisma stage. Unfortunately, he had been interrupted after almost 4 months of peaceful cultivation. Artemis warned him about the appearance of humans who had entered the Stonefield area. This was interesting because Jason didn't expect a human city to be nearby. Because of that, he had decided to stop cultivating while his 3 soul bonds returned to the soul world that had grown gradually with his cultivation progress. Jason hadn't even noticed it, but the number of soul crystals he had created had almost reached 50, which was much more than he required for now. According to other human powerhouses, a beast with a single solidified prismarine crystal required around 11 soul crystals, meaning that a beast at the peak of the first threshold of the Prisma stage required roughly 100 soul crystals. This had made Jason wonder how exactly the future progress with his soul world was going to be. It was not unlikely for him to require thousands of soul crystals once his soul bond reached the peak of the Prisma stage. Hence, Jason couldn't help but feel that the Ascendian stage would bring forth huge changes. This was pure speculation, as it was unlikely for him to require millions of soul crystals to make a beast reach the Ascendian stage. His soul-awakened soul world would merge with his vessel that was in fact his mana core. As such, many changes would happen at that time, and Jason was curious to know what exactly would change. Unfortunately, it would still require some time before he would reach the Ascendian stage, let alone the Prisma stage. Taking his current situation into account, it would take him 9 months until he would reach the peak of the Lick stage with a total of 10,000 liquefied mana drops. This duration was by no means long and extremely short, but it required him to be fully focused, cultivate while being seated at a place, and fully unleash his Celestia aura in addition to the stigma. Because it was unlikely that he could stay unnoticed for 9 more months, Jason estimated that he would enter the Prisma stage at the age of 20 or 21. Right now he was still 18 and was only 2 months away from turning 19, even if he felt much older after the numerous events and incidents he had already witnessed and overcome. The short trip down the memory lane made him smile lightly, thinking that he was quite fast to cultivate, despite his late start and the mana-scarce planet he had been raised on. On average, even members of grand races were 35 years old before they solidified their first prismarine crystal. This may include the untalented, but also exceptional prodigies who were able to attain the feat of solidifying their first prismarine crystal at the age of 14. To Jason, the age of 14 was the time he had been at the mortal stage, fighting against weak beasts that had almost killed him, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that the tides had changed, and even after a late start, he could take over everyone. Nobody would care about his age once he defeated them, and it was only important for him to pay attention to those stronger as well as the being with connections or traits he couldn't evaluate yet. Thinking about prodigies, and traits he had yet to learn the importance of, Jason's mind was subconsciously drawn to the young woman who had been at the peak of the 3 cultivation paths she had awoken. This was what one could call the cream of the crop, and Jason wondered how old she was, and if it was possible to cultivate with 3 repulsive cultivation energies at the same time. However, before he could continue with his train of thoughts, he was distracted by Artemis, who lectured him about paying attention to the surroundings. There were humans and Jason had told them to enter the soul world to be careful, only to stay in the open and do nothing but think about things that were useless for now. Artemis found this callous attitude of his to be annoying and reprimanded him, until Jason apologized to her, several times, calming the little owl down. Sometimes Artemis was extremely bossy, like a little child, only to turn serious, cold, merciless, and so on if required. She could easily adjust her mindset, which was interesting but also dangerous for those who dared annoy her. Now he grew vigilant and used his Emperor eyes in order to scan through the surrounding area while his mana fluctuations, Celestia aura, and stigma had been retracted. Only the bare amount of mana fluctuations were released, supplying his Emperor eyes with the necessary mana. It didn't take him long before he saw a small group of humans, and it only took him a moment to figure out which banner they belonged to. They were cultivating in the path of spiral, and had a faint white hue that intertwined with their spiritual force. This was probably caused by their cultivation technique, making Jason happy. He was glad to encounter humans under the banner of the angel race first. It was not because angels were deemed as good, and devils as bad, but rather because his chances to enter a settlement of the angel race should be much higher. He could manifest Artemis wings and had the aura that should even be superior to the angels themselves. His bloodline was that of the Celestia race after all. As such, with a faint smile, Jason decided to observe the group of humans, for the time being, waiting for an opportunity to either approach them or figure out which direction they were headed to. Knowing the direction from which they came from was already good, and allowed him to figure out the likely direction of the angel settlement. However, they could also be returning from a mission or something like that. Owing to that, he had to know where they were heading, as it might be the path he had to take. Scanning their cultivation base was not exactly difficult, but it caused Jason to realize that his own cultivation stage was still too shallow. Sighing deeply, he peeked from behind one of the stones, trying to see the humans, and realized that they were not much older than him. Even if cultivating prolonged one's lifespan, Jason was good at guessing other beings' age. He did not know if it was something his Emperor eyes caused, or if they were able to see something his mind processed, giving him information he didn't even realize. Nevertheless, he had figured that the humans in front of him were probably youngsters at the age of 30, or younger. In the end, they still belonged to the younger generation, which was below the age of 50 according to the Olympus Federation's standards, with one older human he presumed to be a teacher or something similar, but Jason couldn't be sure whether the same standard applied to beings on Manitou, or not. The young ones had solidified 2 or more prismarine crystals while the older human was at the peak of the prisma stage. Despite not knowing what exactly they were doing, Jason figured that it was unlikely to be an escort mission, and more probably a training for the younger youths. The group of humans was walking around without being too vigilant, and it was almost as if they didn't care about possible attacks of beings at the ascendian stage. However, that was not important, as the more interesting factor was that the double cultivation vein awakened fox seemed to be the group's final goal. This was something Jason figured out as he saw the fox that was at the first threshold of the Prisma stage, facing them head-on, ignoring the existence of the peak Prisma powerhouse completely. Jason found this to be a stupid move, but none of them seemed to mind that the fox attacked the human group as if it was at an advantage. Did they form an agreement before attacking? Just why is the fox so sure that the human powerhouse won't attack? Chapter 618 Training by Hydesgrain. Jason was dumbfounded while looking at the fox that had simply decided to attack the group of humans, without bothering to pay attention to the powerhouse at the peak of the Prisma stage. The man didn't even budge, and it looked like he was just there to protect the young humans that were probably trying to defeat the powerful fox. In some way, it even looked like the young group of 6 humans were familiar with the fox that had a wind and fire affinity seed in his mana core. At the same time, it was able to use psychokinesis and some sort of illusion with which it was creating replicas of itself. This was possible by using spiritual force, and Jason found it extremely interesting because his knowledge about the spiral cultivation path was shallow. He didn't know what perks this cultivation path had, and was glad to be able to figure out more right now. The 6 younger humans were cultivating in the same path, and Jason observed them intently. While unsheathing their weapons, they circulated spiritual force through their body and inserting it into their respective weapons, thereby enhancing them in a way similar to mana. After that, the group of humans charged at the fox, whose fur had distinct green streaks intertwined through the fiery red color in stark contrast. It was only 1 meter tall, but it would be utterly foolish to assume that its small build meant that it was harmless. While the small group of humans charged at it, the fox used its foxfire to conjure several fireballs which it threw towards the group, only to envelop its body with the wind affinity. A moment later, a strong gust of wind manifested around the fox, further accelerating its speed that was already much higher than that of the humans. Suddenly, the 6 humans were utilizing the technique which Jason had already seen a few months earlier, in the battlefield of the devils and angels. As such, by using the particular technique, a white hue enveloped them, giving him the chance to evaluate its strength for the first time. Last time, he had been too far away, and only now could he properly look at the hue. While gazing intently, Jason noticed that it was a weaker version of a normal aura. As a human, he didn't really have an aura, and the reason for that was probably that he had yet to comprehend any. In the end, his Celestia aura was naturally created when he unsealed his bloodline for the first time, undergoing the primal awakening. Because of that, he never had any problems with comprehending an aura, but Jason also never got to know how great his aura was. That was also the reason he wanted to perceive the aura of others, only to figure out that the white hue that radiated from the young men and women was a basic or unrefined version of an aura. Nevertheless, it was interesting to figure out that a technique allowing one to comprehend how to manifest a hue existed. A requirement for this was probably the cultivation path one cultivated in, or something else Jason had yet to figure out. However, what caused Jason's interest to increase exponentially were the benefits of the white hue. Not only did the hue allow the young humans to increase their energy circulation speed, but it also reinforced their body to a certain extent, making them less prone to attacks on their mind. Jason's aura worked similarly, yet was a completely different league, as it protected him from the attacks of others too. Its protection was only to a minuscule degree, but it was one reason for him to be still alive. Furthermore, the Celestia aura made others believe he was friendly and approachable more than it should be in case of their first encounter. It was weird, and just a fraction of what his naturally generated aura could do. Even if that was the case, Jason had received his aura by a stroke of luck, and it was not comprehended or taught in a manual, which he would have loved to read. Jason even assumed that his aura could be strengthened as long as his comprehension allowed him to realize what exactly the aura was and how to improve it. There might as well be several stages of an aura, with the hue being the first one. However, this could also be wrong, thus Jason decided to watch the battle first before anything else. While he had been deep in thoughts, the fight of the fox and the 6 humans had become more intense. The mana around the 7 beings was becoming unstable as they used up much more than Jason could even store. By employing the ability of his Emperor Eyes to the highest degree that he was able to maintain for a few minutes, he observed everything without many difficulties. While observing the battle that was evidently not a life and death fight, Jason was becoming more interested in the fox than the humans with their hues and complex utilization of their spiritual force. Neither the fox nor the humans put their utmost efforts or fought desperately to survive, giving him the reason to think that the fox and humans were familiar with each other and not arch-enemies that were hell-bent to kill each other. That was not necessarily important, but Jason was disappointed because he had hoped to see something magnificent if everyone were to fight with their life on the line. Nevertheless, the complex utilization of spiritual force was completely different than how mana was utilized. In Jason's opinion, mana was relatively simple to use. Circulating it through his body enhanced him from the inside, and enveloping himself with it strengthened his defenses. It was only becoming more difficult with affinities one could utilize because they were versatile with countless ways to be utilized. However, even then, most were using their affinities to the bare minimum, which was only obvious. The less taxing it was to use an affinity, the more often one could use it. Other than that, Jason also knew that most humans on Argos would rather use multiple affinities, each for their respective quality, instead of altering one affinity in order to fit into the task another affinity was much better at. This was caused by the comfort a soul world gave, and the exact thing Jason didn't want to happen. Since he had received an affinity, Jason liked to test his affinities, which was the reason for him to create the ice mist, the poisonous mist, blazing icicles, and so on. In the end, they had been extremely useful in connection with his Emperor Eyes, but by observing the humans in front of him, he found that his mind was still working at a basic level. They're refining their mind as a way to cultivate, which allows them to use their spiritual force in a much more complex way. This, in turn, makes them stronger. That's interesting. Intrigued by the humans, and the fox that were using their spiritual force to create illusions, attack with psychokinesis, and other means, Jason didn't even care about the fact that they were fighting as if this was a training course. If I could refine my brain like them, would I be able to use my affinities in a similarly complex way? Chapter 619, Found by Hydesgrain. All 3 cultivation paths Jason got to know over the recent years were interesting, with each having its own distinct advantage. This was also the reason why Jason wanted to practice all of them at once, like the young woman, who was a halfling, could do. If that was not possible, he wanted to look for a spiral beast as his next soulbond. Even if the memory of Scorpio's death was still painful, Jason didn't think that the pain would ever vanish. His body was ready to cope with the burden of another soulbond, and Jason felt that it was time for him to increase his strength by taking in another soulbond. Thus, he decided that it was best for him to look out for a new soulbond while adventuring through Mana, a world Jason had yet to truly understand. The entire training battle between the fox and the human group took a few hours, which Jason didn't expect. However, after the fight had ended, Jason squinted his eyes because the human powerhouses emerged in front of the fox before one of them took out some fruits, a mountain of spirit stones that were equivalent to mana stones at the Prisma stage, mana stones, and some material he had no idea about. Seeing this, he felt confused, and couldn't help but feel as if the fox had become a paid coach to the young humans and that the humans had given it a small offering. This was extremely weird because the benefits of receiving coaching lessons by the double awakened fox shouldn't be that much better than the powerhouse's teachings, according to Jason. The only plausible reason Jason could tell for the humans to do so was the fact that the fox had double awakened cultivation veins, which made it possible for the young men and women to realize how strong someone with 2 awakened cultivation veins was. It was important to know the difference between having a single awakened cultivation vein and a double awakening. Jason had already noticed the vast difference of having a double, or even triple awakening because he had seen the angel and devil races prodigies fighting against each other. There was also the mysterious young woman he had seen, who clearly showed that the difference of a cultivation stage was nothing to her. Because of that, Jason had decided to stay low-key for the time being and to nurture himself until he would reach a suitable cultivation base so as to roam through the area freely without feeling like a thief, who had to be careful of every single step he took. Unfortunately, his plan was shattered to smithereens before he could even start with it as he heard someone's voice resounding through the stone field. "Little brat, I already noticed you earlier. Why are you observing my students fight? Come out." It was the old man who spoke in the universal language, and Jason knew that he was talking about him. Because of that, he could only curse inwardly, thinking that it was useless to hide and hope for a miracle to happen. As such, he decided that it would be the best solution to face the situation head-on. Emerging from behind the large stone he was hiding, Jason chose to make the best out of his circumstances. He manifested Artemis wings on his back before he released his Celestia aura. After that, Jason simply jumped, catapulting him several meters into the air before adjusting his wings. Gliding towards the group of humans and the fox, who looked at Jason as if he was an old acquaintance and an overly familiar face, Jason could only suppress a sigh. Landing a few meters in front of the group gently, he smiled as if he hadn't been observing them for the past several hours. Wanting to strike a conversation, he began to speak in the universal language. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I thought the occurring battle would be interesting to look at. If it was rude of me to watch the battle, I'd like to apologize." Jason had chosen to talk politely so as to prevent the possibility of irking the humans, or even the fox further. The fox was only looking at him from a safe distance as it diverted its attention to the mountains of equipment. Using spiritual force and mana at once, the fox's next move caused Jason's eyes to bulge because everything enveloped by the mixture of two energies suddenly disappeared. With the help of his Emperor eyes, Jason was able to see more than anyone else, which made it possible for him to witness that the fox had created a small space within its mind to compress items and store them away. It was as if it had created a small storage space in its body, without the need of a spatial affinity or anything like that. Jason was not sure how difficult it was, but for a beast to be able to do something complex like that meant that the fox had to be extremely intelligent. The human powerhouse was able to see Jason's reaction, which gave him a hint about the being's origin, or rather what he was unlikely to be. However, at the same time, the teacher couldn't help but feel odd. He had been unsure of the young being who looked like one of his own, but at the same time, had several differences that made no sense to him. Puzzled by this, he decided to inquire. "You are definitely not a Devere, someone of our race, or an Eos, am I right?" He asked Jason straightforwardly, without caring about the fact that Jason's aura was that of a being similar to an angel like his wings. Other than that, there was an even and golden-colored stigma above his right eye, while his mana fluctuations were much stronger than what the high cultivation base indicated. Under normal circumstances, this would be more than enough for the human powerhouse to be forced to show his respect to the young being, but he had only a mana core, without another cultivation energy. Suffice to say, Jason thoroughly confused the man at the peak of the Prisma stage who followed his instincts rather than needlessly showing respect to someone else. Meanwhile, Jason could barely control his facial expression as he heard the name Eos, realizing that it was the race he formerly referred to as Eos, while Devere was likely to be the devil race he had in mind before. At the same time, he was glad that the human was speaking in the universal language. This told him that it was not necessary for him to learn a new language. Instead of answering the man's question honestly, he pondered about it for a moment, trying to understand what exactly the powerhouse was trying to figure out. Looking straight into the middle-aged man's eyes, Jason didn't back off as his golden eyes gleamed brightly. He didn't fear being attacked by any of the beings around him because the particular hue he could see through his Emperor eyes showed that they didn't have any intention of hurting him. Rather, Jason saw that curiosity was reflecting from them according to their hues. The hue his Emperor eyes saw, and the one actively released were slightly different, and easy to differentiate, allowing Jason to know certain things he had to be aware of. As such, he also noticed the young men and women's stare lingering on him, or to be precise, on the fact that he was cultivating in the path of Marist. After Jason had made up his mind, he was ready to answer the middle-aged man's question. Thus, he looked at him seriously, without the need to seriously try to hide who or what he was. I'm not an Eos, and I doubt that my origin is the same as your race's as well. But, to be honest, I'm a little bit special, and the race I come from looks similar to yours, and is called human. When Jason finished speaking, he noticed the entire atmosphere change around him as the middle-aged man suddenly asked. You said humans. Are you sure about that name? You don't come from Kana, do you? Chapter 620 Primal Human by Hydesgrain. You said humans. Are you sure about that name? You don't come from Kana, do you? Jason was confused to hear these questions. This was only obvious because the human at the peak of the Prisma stage seemed to be confused, shocked, and at the same time interested in what Jason had said earlier. I'm not from Kana, and neither do I know anything about this place or planet. We call ourselves humans on the planet I come from, but I don't know where the name comes from. The earlier excitement of the middle-aged man died down after hearing Jason's words. As such, he was able to stay level-headed as he spoke. That's a shame. Either way, my name is Alfnars, just call me Nars. Those little brats behind me are my students, and the fox, well, it's a Dyskalaya fox. Jason just smiled before he introduced himself. After that, the other students introduced themselves one by one. Even though his mana core rank clearly showed that he was at a much lower cultivation base than the others, they seemed to be kind to him. This was nice to see, and much better than he could have hoped for. Did I worry too much about unfounded issues? Jason wondered before he retracted Artemis' wings. His curiosity about the place called Kana was piqued, which made him want to know more about it. As such, he asked straightforwardly. If it's not too much to ask for as a stranger, what exactly is this place called Kana, and what is so special about my race calling themselves humans? Aren't you all humans too, or are we all a different race? With the multitude of questions, everyone eyed Jason weirdly for a moment, thinking that these were questions everyone should know the answer to. Meanwhile, the Dyskalaya fox simply turned around and left. Suddenly, Nan, the oldest of the students, couldn't help but blurt out. How come you don't know about the origin of humans, if you call yourself one? That's weird. The others had the same question in mind, but they had refrained from voicing their opinion for the fear of coming across as rude. However, Jason didn't mind the question and pondered about it for a moment before answering. Our planet is still in the infant phase and had awoken its mana heart just a little bit over 300 years ago. Because of that, our knowledge is still relatively shallow, let alone the average of our cultivation rank and so on. Sighing deeply, Jason felt depressed while comparing the resources on Mana with those on Argos. Yet, only a moment later, Nars, who was curious about the existence of a human-like race that cultivated in the cultivation path of Marist, asked. If your planet is only at the infant phase, you should be considered to be one of their strongest prodigies, or am I wrong? You should be in your 20s, but your mana core has already reached the mid of the 4th lick stage. That's almost comparable to the youths that were raised on mana. From your mana fluctuations, I can tell that your combat prowess should be much higher than that as well. That's not bad at all. While asking a question with an obvious answer, Alfnars observed Jason's body language, trying to figure out if there were any signs of hostility displayed by the young man. Except for the bare minimum movements Jason did, showing how great his control over his body was, Alfnars didn't detect anything. As such, he calmed down, thinking that the young man in front of him was probably not dangerous to them. Despite that, he stayed vigilant because body language was not everything that counted when encountering a stranger. Mishaps were likely to occur when meeting a trespasser, and being responsible for his students' safety, he couldn't allow anyone to endanger them. Jason knew that Nas didn't want to receive an answer because it was obvious what the answer to the question was. As such, he repeated his question about Kana and the human race that seemed to be special. After Nas had observed Jason enough, he decided that he could answer the young man's question. Jason was extremely interesting, and the fact that he called his race human, while having wings he could retract, a stigma and an aura that radiated more holiness than the ears he encountered, fueled his curiosity further, increasing it exponentially. According to the ancestry tomes, most human-like races have evolved from the so-called primal humans. They're said to be among the first intelligent life forms in the universe, but that is something nobody was ever able to substantiate. The primal humans had been exposed to the first tidal waves of the raw energies we are now using to cultivate our strength. Adjusting and evolving through the torment energies, the primal humans that had been living on the planet Kana slowly transformed, turning into the first beings of new races. Over eons, many races were created through this phenomenon, and only a few particular individuals retained their old looks as primal humans. For example, the majority of your appearance resembles that of a human, if we were to leave out your stigma, golden eyes, and the wings on your back. We are the same, and most of us call ourselves human, or manners, simply after the name of the planet. This method of nomenclature is what most human-like races with a close relation to the old primal human race follow. Your race might do the same in the future after they acquire the necessary knowledge to know that they're not primal humans and that their race's name could be misleading. Jason just nodded his head, trying to make sense of what Nas had just said. So, the primal humans can be said to be the origin of many races that look like humans. Is that why there are so many human-like races, even on Argos? Just how much time must have passed to create countless races through evolution? Somehow, it made sense to adapt by adjusting to the environment and external pressure, but not enough to create billions of races. Maybe from those that had changed, they continued to evolve, turning into beings further away from their origin. So, simply put, all human-like races could, hypothetically, call themselves humans. He wanted to make sure that his assumption was correct and thus asked straightforwardly. No, only your race, the manners and others that have the same appearance and possibly, also the same genetic pool as the old primal humans, can call themselves humans. This is mostly because the ancestry tomes say that you should only call those beings as humans that can procreate with each other. However, even that is a little bit too open-minded in my opinion, because Eos and Devere can also procreate with each other, and nobody would dare to put them under one umbrella. Jason nodded his head once again, his eyes gleaming lightly as he thought about the young woman he had encountered 4 months earlier. At the same time, the thought of his father flashed through his mind, making him wonder whether the Celestia race was also some sort of human race that had evolved from the primal human race. This seemed unlikely, and Jason could only take the last sentence said by Nas as an answer. I cannot put everything under an umbrella. What kind of stupid saying is that? Shaking his head, Jason looked at the group of manners as he wondered. Just how many human races are out in the universe? Have all of them evolved, turning into other races, or have they retained their appearance?